In the last section, we were talking about leaf morphology, and we've wrapped it up with talking about the modified leaves, which includes flower parts. Plants that flower to reproduce sexually we refer to as angiosperms, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the whole process of flowering because angiosperms make up the vast majority of the plants that we use in a landscape setting as well as a turf grass setting. Grasses are angiosperms, as are most of your landscape plants. And so we need to talk about flower morphology, the various parts of flowers. And we're going to start off by looking at an example of what we would call a complete flower. And this figure represents what we would refer to as an idealized or a generic sort of flower. It's called a complete flower because it has both male and female parts. And so we'll get into some types of flowers that only have male parts or only have female parts. But this is a fairly common type of flower. And just to illustrate all the different parts and name them, we're going to consider this complete flower. So we'll start off by describing the outermost sections of the flower. And flower parts are arranged in what are called whorls, which are just circular arrangements of flower parts. And so the pedicel, but it's similar to the word pedestal in that it just elevates the flower parts away from the stem. So there's your pedicel. And the first outermost whorl of the flower is the sepal. Now sepals, as you can see, are typically green. They're leaf-like. They're often thick and scaly, even leathery. And the reason is the basic function of the sepal in most flowers, or the sepals plural, is to protect the flower while it's developing. So it protects the flower while it's so said to be in the bud stage, while it's developing, in other words. Our next whorl on our typical flower here consists of the petals, and the petals are colored pink, as you can see. And in many flowers, not all flowers, but in many flowers, they can be quite showy. They're often colorful. They may have very distinctive patterns on them, even very unique shapes. They often have nectaries at the bases of the petals, which are used to attract insects and other animals for that matter, to come and pollinate this flower. And so the main goal or the main function of the petals is to attract pollinators. The showier the flower is, or flowers that are showy, tend to be pollinated by animals. Most plants that are pollinated by the wind do not produce petals at all. There's no need to produce petals. They would be wasted. They're not relying on insects or birds, for that matter, to pollinate them, so they don't produce the showy parts of the flower. Although they will still produce the sexual reproductive parts, which are the next in line to discuss here. The stamen of the flower is said to be male, and so I'll go ahead and write this in here. And the pistil parts are said to be female. And so the stamen is made up of two distinct portions. We've got a long, slender filament, and at the very tip of the filament, we've got the anther. And as it says in your notes, the filament just elevates the anther out to the outer reaches of the flower. Inside of the anther is produced the pollen, and stamen here within it will say pollen. Pollen grains contain sperm cells. And to have sexual reproduction, as you all know, we have to have the combination of a sperm cell with an egg cell. And you'll find the egg cells in the so-called female parts of the flower, or the pistil of the flower. And it consists of three parts. We've got an ovary, the style, and the stigma. So let's take each of them individually. The stigma is sticky and moist, and it's sticky because its job is to catch pollen grains, which are not sticky. They're very dry and dusty, and so we'll say sticky to catch pollen. The style is simply, I'm going to write it, it's already in the notes. The style is simply functioning to elevate the stigma to the outer portions of the flower. And at the base of the pistil, we find the ovary or ovaries, depending on the species, and the ovary contains ovules. So they contain ovules, which are basically future seeds, and the ovules themselves contain what we would call an egg cell in each. And so looking back at our diagram here, we've got, this is showing 6 ovules, and back to the fact that our anther, which contains the sperm cells or the pollen grains, which contain the sperm cells, are elevated to the outer portions of the flower, as is the stigma. And there's a very good reason for this, and the reason is when bees or other types of insects, here's a little bee, come in, they're going to land on the outer parts of the flower. In the course of getting at the nectar that this flower might produce, they'll land and typically crawl down here to where you find the nectaries at the base of the petals typically. So when they first land, they're already encountering these anthers, which are typically full of pollen, and if they're matured, they're going to cover this bee with pollen. And the bee is also likely to crawl across or land on even the stigma here, and if it has any pollen grains on it already, it will deposit them conveniently here on the stigma. Now when we get to flowering and seed development, we'll talk about how the sperm cells and the pollen grain get from all the way up here in the stigma to down in here where an ovule is, but that's a topic for a later date. So this is our complete flower, and these are all the various parts of it which you're responsible for. All right, not all plants have these complete flowers. In fact, a great many plants do not have complete flowers, and they're called incomplete flowers or imperfect flowers, as outlined in your notes. Within these incomplete flowers, we've got several different types. We've got staminate flowers, and we've got what are referred to as pistillate flowers. And as it says in the notes, and you should probably guess from the naming of the different parts here, stamens being male, pistils being female, that staminate flowers are considered to be male and pistillate flowers are considered to be female. And as I've said a few minutes ago, many plants are not animal pollinated, i.e. insects or birds or some other sort of animal, and are solely dependent on the wind for dispersal of their pollen. And so they tend to not have very showy flowers at all. In fact, even people who are around these types of plants on a regular basis, oftentimes they've never even realized that the plant is even flowering at all when it may be in full bloom, because they tend to not be very showy, and they tend to be pretty inconspicuous. Now, these incomplete flowers may be found on the same plant, and if they are found on the same plant, we call those plants monoecious. And this means it has male, once again, and female flower parts or flowers on the same plant, which basically means the plants are both male and female. On the other hand, we've got plants that are either altogether male or altogether female, and those species that have plants like that we call dioecious plants, and which means they're either male or female. Whether or not a plant is monoecious or dioecious for ornamentals doesn't necessarily play that big of a role. But if you're growing an agricultural crop and the species happen to be dioecious, you would want to have predominantly female plants because female plants are the ones that produce the fruits. In an ornamental setting, there is one example of a dioecious plant that you should be familiar with, and it's a plant that you'll have to learn on your woody plant list in another class, and that is this plant, which is Ginkgo biloba, and this has become much more familiar to the general public lately because of its at least purported medicinal uses or use as a herbal supplement for various things. But this is a tree, and evolutionarily speaking, it's a very primitive tree. It's called biloba because it has a bilobed or two main sections on its leaf. Ginkgo remains a very popular landscape plant, and one of the reasons is in the fall, a ginkgo tree looks like this. And as you can see, it's very bright yellow, and this is one of the brightest yellow fall colored trees that you'll see. And so it remains fairly popular, particularly in the southeast. And a problem with it is it's a dioecious plant, and that in and of itself is not a problem, in that both male and female trees will turn yellow like this. But the problem is the female trees produce a lot of fruit, and these fruits are probably in the size of small plums, a little bit smaller than a golf ball, let's say. They're gold colored when they're ripe, and they just produce lots of these fruits. And so if this were a female tree here, and it started producing all these fruits, the fruits tend to congregate on the ground. And this alone is something to be avoided in a landscape setting because that makes a mess, and they will indeed stain the concrete. And on a sidewalk like this, people who walk by oftentimes and walk over them and don't notice them, they stick to the bottom of their shoes, or they get the syrupy, sugary sap from the flesh of the fruit on the bottom of their shoes, and they carry it in and track it into buildings or vehicles or whatever the case may be, which is messy all in and of itself. But the real big problem with these is the fact that these fruits, when they start to decompose, they smell really, really foul. And so for that reason, long story short, particularly with a ginkgo biloba, it pays as a landscaper to know whether or not you have a male or a female tree. And the one that you want is a male tree if you're using it for an ornamental, because you want to avoid the smelliness and the messiness of the female trees.